As Caroline mentioned, our mandate at Panmure House is to re-examine and apply the insights and methods of Smith and the Scottish Enlightenment here in the 21st century in a practical way through thought leadership and research. We also aim to convene the brightest minds to debate and provide insight on the challenges we face, from building a more sustainable world to fostering free societies. But we also need to know where we came from. Who was Adam Smith? How should we interpret his work? Here we necessarily draw on what can be called Smith scholarship, which can be seen as a sub-discipline of intellectual history. And this literature is incredibly large and vibrant, and there's even an Adam Smith Society. Yet I'd like to suggest that for those that have studied the social sciences that might not necessarily see themselves as Smith scholars, you nonetheless are, because Smith has been so influential. Smith's influence does indeed run deep. Not only did he influence Karl Marx, he also influenced Milton Friedman. But even for those that aren't academics or haven't studied much political economy or moral philosophy, your relationship with Smith is likewise deeper than you may expect. Any history of economic thought and Western moral philosophy is incomplete without Adam Smith. That much is obvious. Yet, much more has been made of Adam Smith. Adam Smith has been used, and you could say abused, to forward political agendas and to reframe the social and economic theories on which public policy is made. Some have used Smith to advocate for free trade and small government. Others have mobilized Smith to advocate for the rights of workers and the welfare state. Tonight, we will learn about how Adam Smith has been a fundamental component in the American experience, from the nation's founding through to the modern era. On that note, it gives me great pleasure to introduce our speaker for this evening, Dr. Liu. Dr. Liu has been a lecturer in the Social Studies Department at Harvard University since 2020. Prior to this, she received a PhD in political science from Stanford University in 2018, where she was a Geballe Dissertation Prize Fellow at the Standford Humanities Center, as well as a Gerald L. Lieberman Fellow, one of the university's highest distinctions for doctoral students. She holds an MPhil in political thought and intellectual history, a second MPhil in classics from the University of Cambridge, and a BA in political economy and classics from the University of California in Berkeley. From 2018 to 2020, Dr. Liu was a postdoctoral research associate in the Political Theory Project at Brown University. And in May 2023, she was appointed Assistant Director for the Center for Economy and Society and Assistant Research Professor at the SNF Agora Institute at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, a post she will take up in July. 2022 saw the release of Adam Smith's America, How a Scottish Philosopher Became an Icon of American Capitalism, a National Public Radio Books We Love selection and a winner of the Prose Award in Economics of the Association of American Publishers. It tells the story of how an unassuming Scottish philosopher captured the American imagination and played a leading role in shaping American economic and political ideas. The book is available downstairs in our interpretation suite following the lecture for purchase. And after hearing her lecture, I'm sure you will want to purchase her book. Glory will be taking us on a journey, that is tonight, from Adam Smith's America. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Glory M. Liu.
Thank you so much for that really generous introduction, Adam. And I just wanted to extend a really warm thank you to you all for being here. I know there are many things you could be doing on this beautiful Scottish day, but you chose to be here to celebrate Adam Smith with me. I also wanted to thank the entire Panmure House team, especially Carolyn and Blair Barrows in the back there, for inviting me to be part of this really prestigious lecture series, and Blair especially for coordinating everything from literally the moment I landed in this country all the way to the dessert that you'll be having tonight. So thank you again for everything that went into making this happen. I also want to thank my parents, Dr. Don and Helen Liu, who are sitting here in the second row, as well as my younger brother, Daniel, who have traveled with me here and have been willingly being dragged along, as I point out, features of the Scottish Enlightenment in the landscape and listening to me nerd out about what this place is all about and why it's so special. And of course, my spouse, Stuart Coppell. Now, as you all know, this is a very special year. All over the world, people are gathering to celebrate Adam Smith's 300th birthday. And if my memory is right, the last time there was a Scotland-based anniversary celebration related to Adam Smith that garnered worldwide attention, it was the 1976 bicentenary of the Wealth of Nations in Glasgow. But Smith scholars and enthusiasts around the world are celebrating something different in 2023. Please excuse my terrible photoshopping skills. I was asked in a recent interview, why are we celebrating Adam Smith's birthday? We're commemorating not just a single work of Smith's, right? It's not just another commemoration of the publication of The Wealth of Nations this year. Right? We're celebrating a multidimensional life. The fact that we're celebrating Smith's birthday, rather than just the anniversary of the publication of The Wealth of Nations or the publication of the Theory of Moral Sentiments, says something about our evolving ideas of why Smith was important and still is important today. Smith is much more than just The Wealth of Nations or the Theory of Moral Sentiments or whichever your favorite book or work is. And I think this really says something about changing perceptions of Smith's lasting importance and enduring relevance that generations of scholars from all over the world, from across different disciplines, not just economics, but philosophy, history, you name it, they'll all be gathered here discussing and debating Smith's life, his ideas, and his legacy in ways that scholars in 1976 or in 1876 or even 1776 could not have imagined. So in the time that I have today, I want to offer some reflections on why this question on this question of why we are celebrating Smith's life and his afterlife. And by way of motivation, there are two variants of this question that I want to pose, which I'm going to use to structure my talk. First, why do we still read Smith today? And second, why should we read Smith today? To the first question, why do we read Smith? I'm going to encourage you to put on your historian's hat with me as I take you back in time and investigate Smith's reception history in America, which is the subject of my recent book, Adam Smith's America. And by drawing on the American context, I hope to show you that there's this long history of reading and reinterpreting Smith, contesting his intentions, and constructing a legacy. And this history has structured the discourse and framed central problematics of political theory and political economy that we still use today. To the second question, why should we read Adam Smith today? I'm going to encourage you to put your political theorist hat on with me as we critically engage with different bits of Smith's writings, just 2 or 3 examples. And we're going to wrestle with the tensions between reading Smith to understand Smith better and reading Smith to understand ourselves better. And finally, I'm going to offer some of my own reflections on what I think Smith offers us today. So, Adam Smith joins a rank of thinkers who have the blessing and the curse of being so well known but so poorly understood. At least in the popular imagination, Smith's name and ideas are largely associated, especially in the United States, with free market economics and a brand of libertarianism, if you want to call it that, whose central doctrine is that of the invisible hand, that individuals pursuing their self-interest can promote the public good without central direction or intention. And we find a wide variety of evidence of the power of Smith's association with this brand of economic thinking. The Adam Smith Society, for example, and this is the US-based Adam Smith Society, proclaims its dedication to the foundational ideas, as they call it, of capitalism, such as individual liberty, limited government, and free enterprise. And American prosperity, they believe, depends on future business leaders' ability to, quote, continue this tradition of promoting free markets, a tradition that ostensibly begins with the society's namesake. And I'm continually surprised by how this version of Adam Smith filters into popular culture. Earlier this year, when I really needed a break from academic reading, I picked up Bonnie Garmus's #1 New York Times bestselling novel, Lessons in Chemistry, which is about Elizabeth Zott, a gifted chemist turned celebrity chef and unapologetic feminist. And it's really disarming when you're in the middle of a beach read and suddenly the protagonist says this: Ionic is the opposites attract chemical bonds. You have to remember, right? She's this chemist, she's a celebrity chef, and she's trying to describe different types of chemical bonds as she's doing a cooking show. And she says, Ionic is the opposites attract chemical bond. For instance, let's say you wrote your PhD thesis on free market economics, but your husband rotates tires for a living. You love each other, but he's probably not interested in hearing about the invisible hand. And who can blame him? Because you know the invisible hand is libertarian garbage. So again, kind of disarming to see it, but I think evidence that this is like one of the most popular associations with Adam Smith, that it even makes it into like New York Times best-selling novels, right? But back to more serious matters. Even in higher education, Smith's reputation might be seemingly politically neutral, but it's still quite narrow. As a very rough indicator, the Open Syllabus Project estimates that Smith's Wealth of Nations is the 44th most assigned text in over 7 million college syllabi across the nation. So just pause for a moment and take that in, right? If we just look at the top 50 titles in their database, there are some rankings that make sense. I know this is really, really small, so bear with me here, right? So you have reference manuals like Strunk & White's The Elements of Style, probably used in most entry-level writing courses that are mandatory for liberal arts education, as well as research manuals and study skills manuals. You also have textbooks in calculus, biology, human anatomy, engineering, and then of course the usual suspects of canonical titles of political and social thought, right? So Marx's Communist Manifesto, Plato's Republic, Machiavelli's The Prince, Hobbes's Leviathan, Said's Orientalism, right? They all make it up here in the top 50 titles. Where does Smith rank? Well, not too far below John Locke's Second Treatise of Government, and W.E.B. Du Bois' The Souls of Black Folk. And also, just above Homer's Odyssey. Not too shabby, right? But if we click on the title, and we actually look, where is the Wealth of Nations assigned, we can find out where the Wealth of Nations tends to get located, right? Mostly in economics and political science, followed by history, a little bit in business, sociology, literature, philosophy, anthropology, law, and theology. Now, maybe you weren't surprised by this. After all, it's Adam Smith, right? One of the greatest thinkers of all time, and so naturally, he should be one of the most read texts in the United States. But my point in illustrating this is that this should actually be quite strange, right? Of all the works published in the 18th century, why does Smith's Wealth of Nations stand out? Especially since the field of economics has changed drastically since 1776. And I guarantee you that of all the places where the Wealth of Nations is assigned, how many people are actually reading the whole darn thing? It's 1,000 pages long. And I did a little bit more digging, and actually the top ranked textbooks in economics is Paul Krugman's International Economics, which is ranked 77th overall, right? So I just wanted to kind of highlight, this is kind of a strange phenomenon. Now, of course, those of us gathered in this room might have different intuitions about why we're still reading Adam Smith, right? Of course, Smith isn't just an economist, so of course this is kind of strange. Rather, he's an ambitious social scientist of the Enlightenment, whose The Wealth of Nations was but one part of a larger science of man. And this science sought to reveal and explain the hidden forces of human behavior that governed human society in all realms of life. And in his first work, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, published in 1759, Smith explored how and why people learn moral behavior through the process of imaginative projection and sympathetic exchange. He also had planned to work on the general principles of law and government, as well as a history of literature, philosophy, poetry, and rhetoric. We now know that neither work was completed, and Smith ultimately had them burned before his death in 1790, a fact that frustrates most Smith scholars today. So given the diversity and breadth of Smith's works, it's unsurprising that a common starting point for Smith scholars like myself is that Smith is unjustly whittled down so often into a mascot for think tanks or just a historical soundbite in textbooks, right? He gets a mention in economics courses as like the father of economics, and then that's it. And what I'm trying to do in my book is offer a history of how and why that happened, and how the history of reading, reinterpreting, and debating Smith's ideas co-evolve with ideas in American political economy. As a political theorist and an intellectual historian, I've been exposed to the breadth of Smith's ideas as a moral philosopher. In fact, the first paper I ever attempted to write on Adam Smith was about his ideas about poverty and inequality across the wealth of nations and the theory of moral sentiments. But as I learned more and more about Smith himself, I was increasingly bothered by the distance between my understanding of Smith and then the whittled down Smith that we get that's associated in kind of the public sphere. So the question that animated my book was this: how, when, and why did Adam Smith become predominantly known as an economist and the patron saint of free market capitalism rather than as a moral philosopher of the Enlightenment? And what are the consequences of that association for how we think about markets, morals, and politics today? Now, before I get into some of the main themes of my book, I want to spend a little time talking about why I chose to write the book in the way that I did. Unlike quite a lot of Smith scholarship, especially in the early wave of revisionist scholarship, this is not what I call a myth-busting book. It's not kind of classic Smith revisionism. Right? I'm not trying to disprove common misconceptions of Smith and then provide a corrective by looking at Smith's texts themselves and offering my own interpretation. So it's not a work of Smithology, in other words. I'm also not doing what some scholars have alluded to as legacy assessment. That is, identifying and defining which features of Smith's or Smithian ideas are kind of true, and then separating out the good legatees from the bad ones. So that's why I consider this a work of reception history, American intellectual reception history. And for me, this idea of reception history is this very active process of reinterpretation and reinvention. It's the line between original intention and impact. It helps explain the difference between what Smith or any other author might have originally intended or meant, and what subsequent readers made of his or her ideas, and what they did with those ideas. And reception history helps us understand why we find the theory of moral sentiments being totally eclipsed by the wealth of nations in many instances in history. And inspiring works of, that's the slide I should have used. As inspiring works of reception history by authors such as Jennifer Ratner Rosenhagen on Nietzsche's reception, Claire Arsenis on the ideas of John Locke in America, and Emily Jones on Edmund Burke's reception in Great Britain show, these kinds of histories are important because they can help us understand how and why certain ideas or certain ways of thinking or reading a text become powerful and why they become politically meaningful. It can also help us understand why certain ideas become so powerful and so charged that they exclude other interpretations of those same ideas or works. As the historian Kimberly Phillips Fine suggested in a recent review of my book, reception history encourages us to think about what intellectual history really is. Do ideas live in the texts themselves and the original intentions of the authors? Or is what matters how the text and the ideas get used, reused, maybe even abused in contexts outside of the ones in which they were originally written? So the history of reading and reinterpreting and debating Smith's ideas co-evolve with ideas in American political economy. And I want to suggest that excavating this history teaches us as much, if not more, about the political and ideological needs that Smith's readers, past and present, they teach us more about those needs than they do about Smith himself. So let's start in the 18th century, contemporaneous with Smith. In the 18th century, an elite cadre of intellectuals and statesmen saw Smith's ideas as contributions to the Enlightenment science of man, an enlightened science that started in Scotland and kind of diffused its way across the ocean into the American minds. The theory of moral sentiments was one such contribution, though not the only one. Published in 1759, Smith's ideas about sympathy and impartial moral judgment appealed to American readers who shared a desire for a secular, reason-based way to understand the origins of morality and to cultivate private virtue and the faculties of a critical mind. For example, in 1786, the work was being recommended among members of the Adams family, America's second family, right? Abigail Adams, the matriarch, Lucy Cranch, and John Quincy Adams all mention it in their private family correspondence. And John Adams used the theory of moral sentiments in a series of essays published between 1790 and 1791 called The Discourses on Davila. And he used passages from the theory of moral sentiments to articulate his worry about a tendency in human psychology to admire and to sympathize with and defer to the wealthy at the expense of the poor. And that part of our human psychology deeply troubled Adams because he saw it as a threat to the democratic fabric of the United States. The Wealth of Nations had a different kind of practical relevance and importance during the founding era. By the mid-1780s, it was being used as the primary textbook for the first college courses on political economy in the 1780s. And those who made use of Smith's ideas did so with an attention to Smith's very technical, theoretical ideas, like the division of labor, as well as Smith's reconstruction of alternative political visions, like those of the physiocrats in France, and use of state power to manage national wealth. Smith's ideas were broadly useful because they distilled general, universal principles of man and society, which could be set into motion by statesmen in the project of nation building at a very early stage. So Alexander Hamilton, who we now know can rap, in the words of Lin-Manuel Miranda, mined the wealth of nations for ideas about the advantages and disadvantages of banking, of public credit, and the impact of manufacturers on economic growth. Right? This was critical for the United States, as they're trying to maintain political and economic independence in the 1780s and 1790s. And James Madison found in Smith's works an underlying logic about the relationship among interests, institutions, and individual virtue, which you can see in Federalist 10. So Smith in the founding era reveals how it was possible to read and use Smith's ideas independently from his intellectual authority. Right? The theory of moral sentiments is just one of many books that individuals use to reflect on private virtue and morality, and The Wealth of Nations is used as a resource for American statesmen. It's kind of like a conduct book who are trying to figure out how to manage a fledgling national economy in an enlightened way. But neither work seems to exert any fundamental importance. And importantly, none of the figures who I've mentioned really kind of invoke Smith's authority by saying, like, I have here in my hand, right, the father of economics, and I'm going to use that as the basis for my ideas. They're just picking and choosing the ideas that align with what it is that they want to accomplish when they're building the new nation. By the 1820s, Americans began treating political economy as more than a branch of politics and statecraft, though. They treat it as a science, right? A field of knowledge production. American educators, writers, and even popular commentators begin to try and make this science of political economy fit specifically for American circumstances. And in doing so, they make Smith into the agreed-upon founder of the science, and they establish patterns for evaluating new ideas, treatises, textbooks that make contributions to this burgeoning field. So as new tracts, treatises, and textbooks are published, they're often compared to The Wealth of Nations, not only in terms of whether an author agrees with Smith's positions, but also in terms of their style and their composition and their organization. In 1831, for example, the prestigious literary magazine, the North American Review, wrote that the great work of Adam Smith, which created the science of political economy, was still the foundation and textbook of this branch of learning, and is in fact almost the only truly original and valuable treatise which we have upon it. The inquirer will there find the great and simple principles which constitute the basis of the science, distinctly stated in the most elegant language, proved and illustrated by curious and instructive details of facts, and followed out into the most important and generally most correct practical conclusions. Did I say 1831? This is 1823. I don't know why those two dates are inconsistent in my script. So at this point in time, right, early 1820s, political economy is still a very nascent discipline. As a branch of moral philosophy, the idea is that the study of political economy would provide moral elevation by way of instruction on the principles of sound management of national wealth for America's future statesmen. In academic instruction, it relied primarily on rich description and illustrations as explanations, not mathematics or statistics as we're very familiar with today. So style and substance go hand in hand with form and function. And the composition of a textbook played a major role in enabling students to grasp the subject and to properly assess its scientific merits. The reason why this is so important is because Smith's literary talents were seen as standard setting in this regard. But there were also many critics, right? Critics who thought that The Wealth of Nations was a bit too loose or inconsistent in language. Thomas Jefferson recommends the theory of recommends The Wealth of Nations at one point and then says it's too prolix and tedious. Or authors who were critical of The Wealth of Nations disagree with the policy implications of Smith's ideas. Nevertheless, The Wealth of Nations survives, not in spite of, but because of the sustained criticism and careful attention to it, which reinforces its status as a foundational text. Even in 1876, a full 100 years after The Wealth of Nations was first published, many readers and educators still regarded it as foundational. Harvard's Charles F. Dunbar wrote in 1876 that The Economist finds the foundations of the science laid deep and solid for the first time by Adam Smith. The great men who have since carried forward the work have declared himself his followers, and in developing and extending the science, have kept the lines of discussion which he laid down with such vigor and insight a century ago. However, over the course of the 19th century, competing visions of the national political economy produced conflicting interpretations of Smith and his relevance for American circumstances. Smith's ideas were taken up, transformed, and heavily politicized in debates over trade, which were, in many ways, debates over slavery and whose version of American political economy or the national economy would reign supreme. So in the hands of free traders, especially from the Cotton South, Smith became known as the apostle of free trade. Northerners, on the other hand, saw Smith's ideas as representing an outmoded way of thinking and incompatible with American interests and manufacturing and growing industrial production. One of the most popular lines of argument is to align Smith with a kind of British conspiracy theory, that free trade is a British conspiracy to kind of cripple American interests. And even after the Civil War, debates over American trade policy intensify, turning Smith into little more than a partisan mascot for free trade and The Wealth of Nations into its manifesto. So by this point, in the late 19th century, it's less the content of Smith's arguments themselves that matter, and more the authority that Smith's ideas conferred. In 1876, there's even a Smith Centennial dinner in New York where guests gather to celebrate the principles of freedom taught in that immortal work, right? And newspapers report on this grand event held at this very famous restaurant called Delmonico's in New York City. It's like a French fine dining restaurant. And you have people giving speeches toasting to the commercial gospel of the wealth of nations at a time when protectionism is raging. But something else happens in the late 19th century. The first set of student notes of Adam Smith's lectures on justice, police, revenue, and arms, now known as the Lectures on Jurisprudence, are discovered. This is an image of the second set of the second set of student notes, but I just wanted to have this image here to remind you that these are student notes that are discovered where we can reconstruct Smith's ideas about the history of law and government. So in the late 19th century, there's this flurry of commentary around Smith's intellectual development and his historical significance. And there's also a debate about the philosophical consistency of his two major works, right? One in which humans seem to be propelled by self-interest in The Wealth of Nations, and the other in which humans seem to be motivated by sympathy and other regarding motives in the Theory of Moral Sentiments. Cohorts of American economists who received their advanced training in Germany during the 1870s and 1880s brought back this kind of German historical sympathy and contributed to a lively debate about the ethical and political boundaries of economic science in America. And they're also writing against the intensification of violent confrontations between labor and capital in the 1880s and 1890s. And this vocal and very prominent, they're called New Generation economists, projected the tensions and contradictions of capitalism in their time back onto Adam Smith, even when they have new information about Smith's intellectual development. And they read Smith as an eclectic thinker whose historical and political thinking offered an antidote to the extremisms of completely unbridled capitalism on the one hand and socialism on the other. But these nuanced readings of Smith get overshadowed by the influence of the so-called Chicago School Smith that emerged out of the ruins of the Great Depression in the United States and takes center stage by the mid-20th century. Chicago economists over different generations used Smith to unify and defend the substantive propositions of economics that came under assault during the Great Depression. Right? These ideas that free markets under specific conditions could be self-regulating and self-stabilizing, and that the freedom to pursue one's rational self-interest underpinned the automaticity of markets. Economists such as Milton Friedman and George Stigler distilled Smith's ideas into a popular and powerful myth. Right? that rational self-interest was the sole premise for the analysis of human behavior and had incredible predictive power, and that the invisible hand of the market, not the heavy hand of government, enshrined personal freedom of choice, right? Freedom becomes freedom to choose. Yeah, he's wearing an Adam Smith tie that's not as nice as the one that Blair's wearing back there. So keep your eye out for the new Panmure Smith House merch. I have not been paid to say that. For Stigler, Smith's elaboration of the idea of self-interest provided what he called a theorem of almost unlimited power on the behavior of man. And for Friedman, the invisible hand illustrated how voluntary acts of millions of individuals, each pursuing his own objectives, could be coordinated without central direction through a price mechanism. Right? And this interpretation placed Smith at the founding of a tradition whose direct descendants were Stigler and Friedman and their Chicago colleagues. Reinterpreting Smith's ideas in this way not only enabled economists like Stigler and Friedman to make claims about being legitimate heirs to Smith's legacy, but it also provided a scientific rationale for Chicago's unique brand of free market advocacy in the 20th century, something that many people often call neoliberalism today. Smith's ideas like self-interest and the invisible hand became synonymous with the market itself, but also with an entire way of thinking about society as being organized through the natural, automatic, and self-generating actions of individual actors. Friedman, especially, made Smith's ideas seem timeless and American. Economic freedom was a prerequisite for political freedom. The invisible hand of the market, not the heavy hand of government, was the only guarantee for individual freedom. And Friedman used Smith's famous image of the invisible hand both as a description for how markets work, but also as a normative argument for how markets enshrine the value of freedom of choice. He elevated Smith to the status of a quasi-American founding father. He said that Smith and Jefferson alike saw concentrated power as the greatest danger to the ordinary man in Free to Choose. And he even said that Jefferson's Declaration of Independence was the political twin of the Wealth of Nations. But the Chicago Smith was not unassailable. They don't get the last word on Smith. This view that Smith symbolized market triumphalism has come under assault from both the left and right, from historians, political theorists, and public intellectuals across the political spectrum, really. And economists and historians of economic thought, such as A.O. Hirschman and Donald Winch, tried to recover Smith's vision of politics and showed that Smith wasn't an anarcho-capitalist, and that by recovering the language of politics that Smith used in the 18th century, we could greater appreciate Smith's distinctive orientation to the nature of politics in commercial modernity. And they're doing this at the same time as the Chicago School is kind of really coming into the spotlight in America. So as Friedman was reaching his zenith in the 1970s, you also have another group of thinkers, neoconservatives, like Irving Kristol and Gertrude Himmelfarb, who turned to Smith to redefine what they believed it meant to live in a moral economy. By drawing attention to Smith's theory of moral sentiments, Himmelfarb and Kristol wanted to argue that Smith provided a way to restore the soul of capitalism for America. That capitalism wasn't just about cold, calculating profit-seeking, but it was also about moral improvement. Smith's organic theory of morality and his faith in individual moral agency and improvement suggested, on their view, that the harsh forces of capitalism don't need to be reined in by government. They don't need to be reined in by state intervention, but they needed to be reined in by individual moral agency. And these ideas about a moral economy or a more moral capitalism, those blueprints can be found in Smith's works. Those ideas of a moral economy or a more moral capitalism can be found in Smith's works, have renewed vitality today, which I'm going to talk about in just a few moments. Okay, so I've just taken you through a whirlwind history that took me over 300 pages to write about in my book in, 20 minutes. But what can we learn from this particular history of Smith's reception and make sense more generally of the two big questions that I posed at the outset, right? Why do we still read Smith, and why should we still read Adam Smith today? Now, one way to answer the question of why we continue to read Smith is a rather unsatisfying one. We read Smith because we've been reading Smith. It's sort of like a path dependency almost, right? It's also not dissimilar from a sort of tautological idea that Smith's important because he's important, and we should read the people who are important. But this isn't a very good answer, in my opinion, right? Given the history that I've just presented, we can observe that the reasons why American readers, at least, have found Smith important, relevant, or particularly useful, those reasons have shifted over time, and they varied with historical circumstance. Not only that, but the grounds on which Smith's authority rests also change. So in the 19th century, assumptions about the scientific universality or the timelessness of Smith's insights in the science of political economy allow Smith's ideas to exert exceptional force in political debate when it comes to free trade. In the post-war period, the Chicago School Smith represented a belief in the scientific rationality of free markets over government interference in economic affairs. Today, amidst a surge of interest in Smith's moral philosophy and political theory, the idea that the force of Smith's ideas is tied to his economic insights. Today, amidst a surge of interest in Smith's moral philosophy and political theory, the idea that the force of Smith's insights is tied to his economics has been challenged, right? Instead, scholars have been increasingly certain that the distinctiveness of Smith's thought lies in the way his moral philosophy speaks to his political economy and political theory. Again, something that I'm going to get to in just a moment. Okay, so why do we still read Smith then? I think we read Smith because as scholars and as well-informed citizens, we are constantly in search of a catalyst for new ways of thinking about economic, moral, and political life in the face of perennial challenges. Smith's relevance has always been political, but global circumstances following the Great Recession, the pandemic, the existential threat of climate crises have raised serious questions about the nature of economic inequality, the normative stakes of economic growth, and the meaning of a moral economy. It's become very convenient among scholars, politicians, and public intellectuals alike to rebrand Smith as both an economist and a moral philosopher, and at some remove, a philosopher of modern capitalism. And by doing that, we use Smith as a way to find both a moral as well as economic rationale for a preferred vision of what we think is a more moral capitalism. For those on the right, Smith authorizes a view of capitalism that emphasizes the power of markets, skepticism of expertise and concentrated government power, faith in local knowledge, and individual moral agency, not unlike the version I presented from the neoconservatives. For those on the so-called left, Smith can authorize a view of capitalism that privileges privileges a concern for the least well-off, mitigating inequalities in wealth and power, as well as using the state to limit private power and promote the ends of distributive and social justice. Now, if I can editorialize for a moment, reflecting on the reception of my work on the reception of Smith has further underscored this point, right? That we can't escape Adam Smith because every time somebody makes a claim about Smith, whether it's historically grounded or polemically bent, those claims become an opportunity to comment on the moral, political, and economic prospects of capitalism, right? Smith always gives us this opportunity to kind of comment on the moral, political, and economic states of capitalism today. And two examples from opposing ends of the political spectrum might illustrate this. Again, these are kind of recent reviews of my book. So on the one end, you have the Wall Street Journal, which decided that my attempt to historicize the different Smiths utterly failed to dismantle reigning assumptions about free markets. Free marketeers haven't won many arguments lately, but they have won the argument over Adam Smith, one Mr. Swaim wrote. No number of academic monographs and journal articles will persuade the ordinary reader that he doesn't understand the defense of free enterprise and free trade in the wealth of nations until he has made his way through the theory of moral sentiments. In other words, you don't need to read the theory of moral sentiments. It should be self-evident that free trade and free enterprise are true, right, or good. So that's from the Wall Street Journal. At the other hand, we have the historian Kim Phillips Fine writing for the New Republic, who suggested that the reason we need Smith so much, even today, and not just debates around him, is precisely because the free market interpretation did so much violence to his thought, right? And that, quote, reading Smith against the grain of conventional wisdom is exciting precisely because he has been so thoroughly claimed by the right. And while it isn't so easy to just assimilate Smith onto the political left, she writes, Smith seems to embody so many of the tensions within capitalism itself. Its roots in rebellion, its obsession with social order and property, its simultaneous extension of freedom and oppression. The irony, of course, is that in seeking out catalysts for new economic, moral, and political thinking, we sometimes become too enthralled by the old. The danger here is not so much an antiquarianism, but rather, as the historian Sophia Rosenfeld recently suggested, reducing Smith to little more than a Rorschach test of sorts, right? That when we read Smith, we're just seeing what we want to see, and that what we want to see might not even be there in Smith. Right? So you might see a winged creature, I might see a string instrument, you might see Smith as a social justice warrior, and I still might see Smith as a cautious conservative. Now this brings me to the million-pound question. Why should we read Adam Smith today? Right? So in the last bit of time I have left, I think I'm still okay on time, yes? Okay. I want to offer 3 propositions for why we should still read Smith today. First, we should read Smith because he asks interesting and important questions. Now let me underscore this point by drawing a contrast between how Smith is often read and misread and how I want us to read Smith. Many readers, past and present, turn to Smith because they want Smith's answers to their questions. Right? Why is free trade good? What's the matter with inequality? What are the moral foundations of capitalism? What kind of a problem is poverty? We pose the question, then we go to Smith looking for an answer to assemble. My view on this is that that's the precisely wrong way to go about reading Smith. Right? Too often we get very distorted versions of Smith where people simply want his answers to authorize their own preconceived political or ideological positions. We should read Smith not because we want his answers or his positions, but because we want to better understand the nature of his questions and his approach to problems. So rather than assuming that Smith has an answer to questions that we're asking for ourselves, we ought to carefully reconstruct the way Smith posed questions, puzzles, and problems, and be attentive to the way those questions are generative of interesting insights. Now, easier said than done, right? The problem is that Smith doesn't always write in a style that's particularly conducive to identifying what the central question or puzzle is, because there are so many. And his sentences are often very declaratory at times, or extremely digressive. He doesn't say, like if you're used to reading a kind of political science journal or like a political theory journal, my research question is X, right? My argument is Y. So we have to play a bit of jeopardy here. And I'm going to illustrate this with one example from the introduction and plan of the work from The Wealth of Nations. So this is when Smith is kind of foreshadowing what he is going to be saying in Book 3 of The Wealth of Nations. He writes, "Nations tolerably well advanced as to skill, dexterity, and judgment in the application of labor have followed very different plans in the general conduct or direction of it. And those plans have not all been equally favorable to the greatness of its produce. The policy of some nations has given extraordinary encouragement to the industry of the country, that of others to the industry of towns. Scarce any nation has dealt equally and impartially with every sort of industry. Since the downfall of the Roman Empire, the policy of Europe has been more favorable to arts, manufactures, and commerce, the industry of towns, than to agriculture, the industry of the country. The circumstances which seem to have introduced and established this policy are explained in the 3rd book." Now, what I typically do when I teach Smith, and I read this with my students, I ask them, okay, what is he saying? Right? What is the question that he's trying to answer? I had a professor at Stanford who, anytime somebody was giving a prospectus presentation, he would say, what is the question to which your dissertation is the answer? Right? So be attentive to the question. What is the question or puzzle that Smith is trying to set up, that he's explaining in Book 3, right? He's not just giving us facts, he's trying to answer a question. So what is it? On my reading, it's something like this, right? Throughout history, different nations have made different policy choices that affect their output. What were the circumstances in Europe that have enabled policies to favor manufactures and commerce over agriculture? This, to me, is where Smith is most generative and interesting as a thinker. Because once we realize that that is the question that Smith is tackling, and it's just in one part of The Wealth of Nations, we start to see history and human society and political economy in a different way, right? We start to study things the way Smith is studying them, rather than the way we're trying to study them. Now, this brings me to my second proposition, right? So first, we should read Smith because he asks interesting questions. Second, we should read Smith because he shows us the power of historical thinking. How does Smith actually go about answering the puzzle he poses in Book 3 of The Wealth of Nations? It's a historical question that requires us to examine what happened in Europe since the downfall of the Roman Empire. And here I'm going to give a nod to my colleague Paul Sagar in the back, Dr. Paul Sagar, thank you, whose new book, Adam Smith Reconsidered, is incredibly instructive on this. So what I'm about to say is really what I've learned from reading Smith from reading Paul's work. So Smith is a deeply historical thinker, right? Smith takes history to inform explanatory theories of how he thinks human political and economic and social development might go, right? We start off as hunting and gathering in our early forms of subsistence, then shepherding, then to the development of agriculture, and then what he calls the kind of advanced state of society, commerce and intricate trade networks. And he draws up this simple theory of what he calls the natural progress of opulence based on what he takes to be real human development history. And that these patterns are, by his standards, observed with some degree of regularity and generalizability in the historical record. But here's the catch. The theory comes out of a view of history, but then history also has to verify it, right? You have to put it to the test with different historical case studies. So Smith will take this theory of the natural progress of opulence, right, and scrutinize the cases where the theory fails to explain what actually happens. It turns out, in Europe, commerce and manufacturing developed before and to a much larger extent than agriculture. And this is a complete inversion of what the theory predicts. Smith is not a one-size-fits-all kind of thinker, right? We need history to make sense of the contingencies of social, economic, and political development. And this brings me to my third and final proposition. We should read Smith because Smith doesn't give easy answers when we want them. Let me illustrate what I mean with an extremely nerdy example from a bit of Smith that I've been interested in recently, and that's Smith on taxation in Book 5 of The Wealth of Nations. Now, many a Smith scholar point to Book 5 of The Wealth of Nations as if it were kind of straightforward policy advice or evidence that Smith is not a libertarian, right? Because look, this is the book where Smith talks about taxes and roads and public education and the sovereign. And one very famous quotable moment is when Smith outlines his 4 maxims on taxation. Right? Taxes need to be proportional based on people's ability to pay. They should be certain in their timing, convenient to collect, and economical. Right? You don't want to overburden the tax base. Seems straightforward and commonsensical enough, right? Wouldn't it be great if all tax regimes kind of maximized every single one of these propositions? But then Smith goes on to show in historical example after historical example countless taxation regimes that repeatedly fail to realize any number of these maxims, right? Indeed, so much of Smith's analysis illustrates the difficulty and the trade-offs that states face in trying to pursue these objectives, right? So strap on your boots as I take you into the weeds briefly, but I hope it will be illuminating. So Smith spends some time talking about a land tax in Great Britain, which during his time, he's writing in 1776, had gone virtually unchanged since the 1690s. And Smith observes that the British land tax was hardly proportional, right? So bad on proportionality. Those who were least able to pay were most burdened by it. But that it was perfectly agreeable, he writes, in terms of its certainty, convenience, and economy. What about the alternative? Well, he looks at a proposal put forth by the French economists who proposed taxing the rent of land on a sliding scale to maximize revenue. But the problem with this tax, Smith suggests, is that while it's far more proportional and equal, it's far less certain, far more inconvenient, and very expensive to levy. So there are no easy answers, right? He doesn't come down on one side and say, we should do what the French do, or we should do what we have been doing since 1690. He says, no, these are these specific circumstances where you get these trade-offs between different criteria that you care about. Now, Smith's analysis here can seem rather tedious and unsatisfying. It's not the lightest reading in this part of The Wealth of Nations, but we can better appreciate what Smith is offering here if we get out of the mode of hunting for answers from Smith and into the mode of identifying the question or the puzzle, right, that I alluded to. What I think Smith is doing is he's trying to identify a fundamental feature of what it is that governments have to do, right? They have to raise taxes to support their operations and the trade-offs that are involved when they try to do it. Under what conditions does it make sense to have a tax regime that optimizes for proportionality? Under what conditions might it make sense to optimize for certainty and economy? And how do states generate reasonable expectations for those who bear the burden of paying taxes? When it dawned on me that those were the kinds of questions that emerged from Smith's book, Smith's analysis in book 5, right? Not questions like, what is the most equitable tax? Or is Smith an egalitarian? Would Smith support wealth taxes on the rich, right? I had a different understanding of what kind of a thinker Smith is and why his works speak across time. Right? Smith isn't trying to change a policy per se or establish a new position or put himself on a kind of spectrum of political views. He's trying to change the way people think about political economic problems. Right? He refuses to give answers that can be assimilated or easily categorized by conventional labels, progressive, conservative, left, right. He's too historical, too aware of the contingencies of politics, too infuriatingly balanced, as Donald Winch once called him. So my plea, to conclude, is that if we're going to read Smith today, we pay more attention to the questions that Smith asked rather than the answers he gave, and that we're more attentive to how he tried to answer them rather than characterizing any settled political position that he might have held or could belong to today. And if we can do that, I can think of no better way to honor Adam Smith on his 300th birthday this year. Thank you. Oh.
That was fantastic, I think, for many reasons. Before we go to the floor for some questions, I just wanted to say that what you presented and the Smith that you presented is in many ways what we're trying to achieve here at Panmure House, right? So we've almost very recently have been referred to as the Adam Smith Institute. And I say, wait a minute, whew. That's a different view of Smith, which is much more prescriptive in policy. And what your book demonstrates and what you show in the book historically, from the inception of when he wrote and how it influenced American history and American political economic thought and the discipline of economics, was that he's been molded in ways to serve certain people's interests. But that doesn't actually fit with who Smith was. And Smith was actually someone who asked hard questions, gave really dense answers, right? So if you ever try to read through The Wealth of Nations or The Theory of Moral Sentiments, which I find much harder to read, it is really difficult to understand, well, what does this person, what does he actually mean? And I think I thought you're putting that, rereading that text for the 21st century, for your 21st century student, helped me definitely. But that's what we actually need to do. It's take Smith and debate those ideas and not be prescriptive, because these are the challenges. There's trade-offs with all policy making, right? But on that question, I would like to ask a slightly hard question in the sense that we can't really say this was Smith's politics. Yeah. But we can still say that Smith was a liberal. He was still a proponent of markets. Yeah. Correct? I mean, so what I guess the question is what can we give to the libertarians? But then again, what can we give to the social democrats that allows us to say this is what Smith would say, but then,
Sure. So I think it's worth unpacking. First of all, great question. I think it's worth unpacking what liberal would have meant to Smith, and that it's very different than what we call liberal in the United States, or what would be called liberal here in the UK, right? Liberal for Smith in the broadest 18th century terms would have just meant like human liberty is an important thing, and that our kind of political views are really centered on the fundamental importance of human liberty. But what is human liberty and what kind of liberty matters? For Smith, and again, just plug for Paul's book, the liberal view of human nature isn't just freedom, it isn't just an economic freedom, right? It's not just buy and sell and consume and be whoever you want to be in the market. It's not just that. In fact, I would say that that's maybe secondary to a kind of political view of liberty, which is freedom from domination. Freedom from domination, both public and private actors. So living under despot is a form of political domination, right? Being a slave is a form of political domination. What matters for Smith is that you are not living in a feudal society where your job, your occupation, your clothing, and who you can marry is determined by your feudal rank, right? So the kind of freedom that Smith saw was so important about kind of the age of commercial modernity that markets brought in, was that people weren't tied to ranks and classes that trapped them for life as a form of domination, right? So the political liberalism, if you will, with a caveat for the political theorists in the room who think of like Rawls when I say the word political liberalism, but it is a view of non-domination in a political sense, that you're not dominated by other groups of public or private or any individual actors, and that the freedom to participate in the market is just one part of that. So you can see how that view of Smith being a liberal cuts across the libertarians, right, who say like freedom of contract, like child labor is okay. I don't endorse child labor. I hope nobody else does here. But also the kind of social democratic view, which would say, look, the domination of huge firms in the way that they structure the lives of their workers, not giving them bathroom breaks, firing them if they hold political views or criticize their bosses, that is a form of political and economic domination that Smith would have been disgusted by, right? And that is the kind of domination that he's worried about when he's criticizing the British mercantile system in Book 4 of The Wealth of Nations.
No, I think that's absolutely, why Smith is so beautiful as a, well, I shouldn't say so beautiful. There was people that said he actually wasn't that beautiful.
Right, he had like really big
teeth and stuff, right? But
like kind of awkward.
But what's nice about Smith is he allows us to debate so many of the fundamental issues without having to, define your politics before you do so. It allows us to debate those. The real questions without being accused of being a libertarian or, a liberal in the American sense, or even a socialist for worrying about workers' rights, for example.
Right.
And that's what he's such a fascinating thinker. Before I ask another question, well, actually, I'll move to the thing. I just wanted to note, she's mentioned Paul Sager a couple of times, who is here with us, who has a fabulous book, which I've read as well. He will actually be giving a talk during the Fringe here in Panmure House. So if you're interested in Paul's, this is a plug for Paul because you gave him a plug. I'm going to give him another plug. So do sign up for our newsletter and try to get tickets to come and listen to Paul's.
I wish I could have been invited to be like, I'm part of the Edinburgh Fringe Festival.
Yeah, well.
Speaking on Adam Smith.
Right. Okay, so I have many questions, but I don't want to dominate the Q&A. So if
Can I actually ask a question to the audience?
Absolutely.
How many people here have read The Wealth of Nations?
That's actually quite a few hands.
That's
no,
not bad.
that's,
Okay, what about the theory of moral sentiments?
Fewer hands go down.
Yeah. Okay.
Actually, no, it's pretty good.
That's pretty good. That's pretty good. Lectures on jurisprudence.
There's a lot of Smithians. But okay, then
Paul.
there's one right there. That's one of the notes. But hopefully, I think, just before I ask the question, what I mentioned in my intro to you is that even those of you that you've read The Wealth of Nations, or you've studied economics, or you've studied political theory, and you think, yes, I know what Smith scholarship is. But I think the history that she's shown, yes, it's very specific to the American experience, and I think PBS should make an American experience based on yours. That'd be great. This book could be written again about Smith in the British context. Smith even in the German context, right? I mean, das Adam Smith problem was big. So, and Smith is mobilized all over the world. I mean, we had the president of Zambia here at Panmure House a few weeks ago, speaking right where you spoke, and he spoke eloquently about how Smith has influenced him. And obviously he's a business person and studied economics, but what I hope you took away from our talk is that he has become this icon within which our political economic history has been made. So even if it's the American experience, it's still part of this global economic history. So that's why he's so thank you for writing a great book. So I want to ask if there's anyone in the audience that would like to ask a Yes, there's one question there.
There's a footnote in your book which says, I read the book, really enjoyed it.
Thank you. Read the footnotes too.
One footnote says somebody had written a book or a pamphlet or a paper about Chicago versus Kirkcaldy.
Ah, yes.
Now, we come from Kirkcaldy, and recently the Freakonomics people, Stephen Dubner, came to Kirkcaldy.
Yes.
And when they came to Kirkcaldy, when they saw Adam Smith's house, well, it's not that there's a plaque on the wall, and it's where the marketplace was, literally outside his window,
Yeah.
and where the harbour is, where the boats would come in, the pennies all dropped in the sense that much of Adam Smith's thinking is based on that.
Yeah.
Which is, if you like, microeconomics, as opposed to much of what is written is macroeconomics. And I just wondered if you think that is actually relevant to Adam Smith's legacy and his writing, and it makes it easier to understand that he was about people as well.
Yeah, couldn't agree more with that. So I think the paper that you're referencing is by Jerry Evensky, Paul, is that right? The Chicago Smith versus Kirkcaldy Smith. And the Kirkcaldy Smith is the kind of the theory of moral sentiments and the Wealth of Nations version of Smith, right? That's more historically situated. It takes a broader view of Smith's works. And the Chicago Smith is just the kind of invisible hand neoliberal Smith, if you will. But I would totally agree with you that what Smith does in the Wealth of Nations is so much more than microeconomic theory and macroeconomic theory. I usually describe it as it's a work about economic life, how we meet our needs. Right? We can meet our needs through foraging, through herding, through feudal regimes and agricultural cultivation, and through trade. And he takes us through different ways in which the way we meet our needs are arranged, right? So it's about economic life and how we meet our needs, but it's also about political economy, which is what are the rules and the norms and institutions that we create that structure the way we meet our needs, right? So feudalism is one of those ways that determines the kind of economy of how we meet our needs. Commercial society is a way in which we relate to one another through relationships of exchange, but how do you govern that? What are the rules you create, right? Mercantilism was a really bad way, or the mercantile system was, in Smith's view, not a great way of organizing that, because what you ended up with was private firms like the East India Company wreaking havoc abroad, and then monopolizing markets at home in a way that really oppressed the public, right, and delivered bad products at outrageous prices. And so when you look at how Smith structures the Wealth of Nations, where the first two books, right, division of labor, rent, value, prices, and then like capital, stock, that's in the realm of what most economists today would be like microecon. And then they stop reading the Wealth of Nations. And then book 3, he turns to history. And he goes, what are the institutions that structure the way in which different ways that wealth flows and the different ways in which we meet our needs make, like, things go wrong, right? And then he gets to book 4 and he brings it up to the present and he says, look at what's happening in Great Britain now. And then he gets to book 5 and he says, given that I've laid this theory out about kind of how the division of labor works in economic life, thinking about real humans who go to a physical marketplace to exchange and meet their needs, right? This is the penny drop moment. I remember that. You can hear somebody go, oh, in the background when they say, this is the market. They're not talking about an abstract market of buyers and sellers and a supply and a demand graph. They're talking about a physical place where there were certain days that the market was open, where you brought your goods and you exchanged. So that's what makes it really, really human. And Smith shows that like you can't take the human analysis out of like real historical and political circumstances. And that's why I think the Wealth of Nations looks the way that it does. So it's so much more than just like, it's not a theory of value. It's not even a theory of, in part it's a theory about economic growth, but it's also about what thwarts growth and how value gets distorted.
And that's where the Chicago schools said, no more history, no politics.
Right, no history, no
nothing,
politics.
no
just-
institutions, just, and that's right. Other questions?
So if Smith was with us tonight, producing a new edition of both books, what would be the big question he would be asking about the emerging significance of artificial intelligence?
Oh my gosh. Well, one concern that I think he would probably have is, who does the technology benefit, right? I think that's one question that we're not asking enough when we have our apocalyptic worries about artificial intelligence and, the robot apocalypse. We can see it coming and it's going to end humanity, but with technological innovations like this, it's always disproportional about who benefits and who loses out. And so I think he would encourage us to think about, how will this perpetuate existing inequalities, rectify others, or create new ones? And I think that that's what's going to be a huge societal issue. I mean, I was actually just at a conference on it's called the political ideologies of Silicon Valley, and what I really learned from researchers within the industry is that things like, ChatGPT-4, right, like really, really high-powered artificial intelligence, we worry about it like taking over the world, right, and becoming sentient and self-aware. And people who know the industry really well are like, no, it's actually just going to wipe out middle-level management. It's this very mundane business tool that's just going to wipe out HR. And that's not what's happening.
That might be a good thing, right?
Maybe.
I see a lot of hands going
we
up.
don't know, but this is the kind of thing that I think Smith would ask us. It's like, who are the winners and who are the losers, and where are we not thinking about the winners and losers? Because if you look at the kind of hype economy in the media, right, it's like, oh no, AI is going to become sentient. it's going to replace everybody. But then when you actually talk to experts in the field, they're like, it's just going to wipe out middle-level management. And then what are all those good people going to do? So, that's my hunch. Maybe I'm projecting that back onto Smith, but. And
he would also be concerned about who's controlling the AI,
exactly.
Right? So it's the winners and losers, but then he would be worried about the Googles and the Amazons that are controlling these algorithms. Who
has the power to make the policy that governs them? That's the other thing, right? It's an entire economy of its own, and who is making the law? I think my favorite part to teach in The Wealth of Nations is the first chapter of book 4, where he walks through why it is that the mercantile system became policy, why it became the law of the land. And it's because you have merchants who collude with legislators in making laws that benefit themselves, right? And I think that is precisely the worry that we have with big tech, at least in the United States. Right?
No, same
Who's
here,
making
same
the
here.
laws?
Yeah, exactly. Robbie has a question back.
I'd like to go back to Chicago just for a moment.
Sure.
And I'm wondering to what extent Stigler and Friedman, when they were inventing the fable of how economics emerged, actually needed someone like Smith as they were working to overcome the American institutionalist framework. I see you're nodding, so the answer might just be yes.
Yes. The answer is yes. Chicago's brand of economics was considered very heterodox in the 1930s and 1940s before Stigler and Friedman arrived. Their teachers, Frank Knight and Jacob Viner, Henry Simons, Aaron Director's a little later, were really kind of the founders of Chicago price theory, which is basically neoclassical price theory, but they were kind of a rather small cohort of American intellectuals who really wanted to defend and revive the principles of classical liberalism at a time when that was very not in vogue. It's, as I say, kind of jokingly, after the Great Depression, it's not a good look to be defending more free markets, but they're a small group, and it's a kind of transatlantic network that still does that. And so Stigler and Friedman are kind of joining this Chicago tradition, but in a much more vocal and much more politically directed way. Smith had always been in the background. Jacob Viner wrote this amazing, really important essay in 1927 called Adam Smith and Laissez-Faire, which he tackles head-on the Adam Smith problem, right? Like, how compatible are the theory of moral sentiments and wealth of nations? He had a much more nuanced and sophisticated and historical reading of Smith. By the time we get to Stigler and Friedman, Stigler is using Smith in his academic publications and economics journals, but it's really more of a kind of like economic mouthpiece, if you will, and motivation to show that like their version of Chicago price theory has its antecedents in Smith's thought, right? So it's a form of intellectual legitimation, but it also works really well in Chicago's favor because of the kind of eye towards a more free enterprisey politics that's associated with their methodology. So I've said this in other places, and this is the last thing I'll say, that like Chicago economics gets a really bad rap in the United States because it's just so seen as like just market fundamentalism as this kind of political ideology. But more than anything else, in the time period that I'm writing about, Chicago economics is methodology. And Smith gets kind of assimilated into that.
There almost should be two schools, right? The
Yeah,
Frank
kind of
Knight,
old and new.
Old and new,
Yeah.
but it demonstrates how the time periods were so significant for shaping the questions they were asking and how they were doing. Same with, I think, of Hayek, right? He was coming from an authoritarian context, and it was, driven him to defend liberalism at a time when authoritarianism and totalitarianism was so significant. I think understanding the sociology of economics is quite important to understanding what's shaping the methodological and theoretical decisions. Right. Well, this was a fantastic lecture. It's very much at home here at Panmure House on a very special period for us on the 300th anniversary of Adam Smith this week. I want to thank you all for coming here and spending this beautiful evening where you could be out on a terrace somewhere, out in the park, but you've chosen to immerse yourselves in Smith and his intellectual contribution, not simply to Edinburgh, but to the rest of the world. So please, let's thank Dr Liu for giving us a fabulous lecture, and thank you all for coming.